How can one not just defeat, but literally obliterate 3 invincible Roman legions, 20,000 professional soldiers, the most advanced war machine of its time? It's commonly believed they were doomed by the Germanic forests, foul weather, and the fury of untamed barbarians. But this is a convenient lie, masking a far more terrifying truth. This isn't a story of military defeat. This is a blood-chilling thriller about the most sophisticated betrayal in ancient history, masterminded by a brilliant double agent. I invite you to become not just a spectator, but an investigator in a 2,000-year-old cold case. Together, we will crack the code of this catastrophe to understand how one person could bring down the might of the world's greatest empire. Let's transport ourselves for a moment to Germania in the 9th year of the Common Era. Forget everything you know. Feel it. The air here is heavy and humid, smelling of decaying leaves, damp earth, and pine needles. A perpetual twilight reigns beneath the canopies of giant trees where scarcely any sunlight penetrates. There's a silence, not peaceful, but oppressive, ominous. And into this silence intrudes a completely alien sound, the monotonous shuffling rumble of thousands of hobnailed caligae, the creak of leather harnesses, the clatter of metal, and muffled commands in a gravelly Latin. A Roman legion is on the march. It is not part of this world. It is an anomaly, a steel worm gnawing its way through an ancient, hostile forest. By night, the camp transforms into an island of order amidst an ocean of chaos. The thick air is saturated with the smoke of thousands of campfires, the scent of human and mule sweat, sour wine diluted with water, and the aroma of boiled wheat porridge, a legionary's simple, hearty dinner. Not only the Latin chatter of veterans is heard, but also guttural shouts in dozens of dialects belonging to Gauls, Thracians, and Illyrians from the auxiliary cohorts. Everything here is subject to routine: changing of the guard, cleaning of weapons, repairing of sandals. Beyond the palisade in the darkness, a wolf howls or a branch cracks under a heavy paw, but within the perimeter, an unbreakable certainty reigns. Rome is here, and therefore civilization is here. To understand these people, one must grasp their primary cultural code: disciplina. For a Roman, disciplina isn't just parade ground drilling. It's a fundamental principle of the universe. It's the belief that any chaos, be it untamed wilderness or a barbarian society, can and must be ordered through straight roads, standardized camps, unified laws, and of course, the force of arms. A legionary isn't merely a soldier, he is a bearer of supreme order. He believes his square scutum shield and short gladius sword are tools less of war and more of civilization, transforming wild spaces into a Roman province. But on the other side, deep within the forests, a completely different truth resides. For the Germanic peoples, there's no concept of a state or law. Their world is built on a personal oath of loyalty to a chieftain. This concept could be called a comitatus, a warband, a brotherhood in arms, where honor is valued above life, and betraying one's chieftain is the worst of sins. For them, freedom isn't a philosophical concept, but a physical reality. The ability to live on their ancestral land according to ancestral laws, without paying tribute to outsiders or obeying their commands. They weren't savages. They were simply different, and their world was entirely self-sufficient before the arrival of the Romans. In this clash of two worlds, the Roman project to conquer Germania wasn't merely a war. It was the most audacious and arrogant venture startup in history, with the state as its investor, and the goal wasn't just conquest, but a complete reprogramming of reality. The legions weren't an invading army, but rather a hybrid of an engineering corps and the security detail of a mega-corporation that had arrived to develop wild assets. They built roads through impassable swamps, erected forts, and attempted to install their operating system, Roman law and taxes, onto an utterly incompatible phenomenon. It was precisely this hubris that doomed Publius Quinctilius Varus. An experienced administrator, not a soldier, he viewed Germania as just another spreadsheet entry in his report. He didn't hear the warnings in the whispers of the wind, nor did he see the hatred in the eyes of those he considered subdued. For him, these dense forests were merely an annoying obstacle that would soon be bisected by arrow-straight Roman roads, and the defiant tribes nothing more than a line item in a tax ledger. He was absolutely certain his system could not fail. But the system encountered something it could not compute, the genius of betrayal. The genesis, the very catalyst that unleashed this hellish mechanism, wasn't a battle, but a mundane bureaucratic procedure. Governor Publius Quinctilius Varus, having moved his summer quarters deep into Germania to the banks of the Weser River, began doing what he did best, administering. He summoned chieftains to courts, settling their age-old disputes according to Roman law, which they simply did not comprehend. He imposed taxes, demanding silver from people whose economies were built on barter and subsistence farming. For Varus, this was routine Romanization. For the Germanic tribes, it was a profound humiliation and a direct threat to their way of life. The air thrummed with unspoken menace, but the self-assured governor felt none of it. And at this moment, the engine of this entire story steps onto the stage. Arminius, chieftain of the Cherusci tribe. Do not picture a savage in animal skins. Arminius was a product of the Roman system at its finest. He spent his youth in Rome as a noble hostage, gained Roman citizenship, learned Latin, rose to the rank of eques, and commanded a unit of Germanic cavalry in the empire's service. He was the ideal double agent, one of their own to everyone. To the Romans, he was an example of a barbarian successfully integrated into the civilized world. To the Germanic tribes, he was one of their own who knew the enemy from the inside out. He was the key, perfectly fitting the Roman lock. No one suspected his goal wasn't to open the door, but to break the mechanism forever. The grand idea wasn't born of hatred, but of knowledge. Serving in the Roman army, Arminius absorbed its essence. He saw that the legion's strength lay in their predictability, their logistics, their roads, their standard procedures. And he understood that this was precisely their greatest vulnerability. All he needed to do was lure them out of their familiar environment, lead them where their rules didn't apply, where a straight road became a deadly path and a disciplined column, a helpless crowd. His plan was brilliant in its simplicity and devilishly audacious in its execution. Provoke a false uprising in a distant tribe, convince Varus to suppress it by taking a shortcut through an unfamiliar forest, and there, in a narrow defile, orchestrate a slaughter. This wasn't just a battle plan, it was an intricate political operation. Arminius had to secretly unite dozens of warring Germanic tribes. He negotiated, persuaded, flattered, threatened. He appealed to their pride, played on their fear of assimilation, and painted pictures of a future where their children would speak Latin and forget their gods. He was the glue that, for a brief but decisive time, bonded the fragmented mosaic of the Germanic world into a single fist. And they believed him because he spoke to them in their language, but already thought like a Roman strategist. But not everyone was thrilled. Arminius's idea exploded like a bomb among the Germanic chieftains themselves. His fiercest opponent was his own father-in-law, the powerful chieftain Segestes. Segestes was a staunch advocate of alliance with Rome and considered Arminius's scheme pure madness, believing it would bring punitive expeditions and total destruction upon their lands. He saw his son-in-law not as a liberator, but as a dangerous adventurer willing to burn his entire people in the fires of war for personal ambition. The conflict of ideas escalated into personal hatred. It was Segestes who tried to avert the disaster. On the eve of the fateful march, at a farewell feast for Quinctilius Varus, he openly addressed the governor. He revealed the entire conspiracy, naming Arminius and his accomplices, and pleaded with Varus to arrest them all immediately. But Varus made the gravest mistake of his life. He saw not a warning from a loyal ally, but a mundane family squabble, a settling of scores between a father-in-law and a son-in-law. He looked at Arminius, this charming, educated, loyal officer, so much like a Roman, and simply could not believe in his treachery. He politely declined Segestes' offer. Thus, all the pieces fell into place on the board. The ingenious plan was set in motion. The fragile alliance of the Germanic tribes was sealed by an oath. The warning was ignored, and 3 Roman legions, unsuspecting, prepared to march on their final journey, led by a man who smiled courteously at his commander, already knowing that in a few days he would send him and his entire army to hell. The central metaphor, the key to understanding this catastrophe, is that it wasn't a battle. It was a perfectly engineered conveyor belt of death, designed by a man who knew the Roman war machine inside and out, and found a critical vulnerability in its code. Arminius had no intention of fighting the legions on their terms. He created conditions in which they ceased to be an army and transformed into a doomed mob. And this conveyor belt consisted of several flawlessly synchronized components. Step 1. Choosing the perfect crime scene. Arminius spent months searching for the ideal location, and he found it. A narrow strip of land, a true bottleneck no more than 100 meters wide, squeezed between the slopes of Kalkriese hill on one side and the vast, impassable Great Bog on the other. For a Roman column stretching 15 kilometers, this meant it would funnel into the trap piecemeal, hour after hour, without even suspecting it. Here, the legions could not deploy into battle formation. They could not employ their famous tactics. They were stripped of their primary advantage, space for maneuver. Step 2. Engineering preparations. This is where Arminius's genius shone through. Along this entire narrow passage on the hillside, the Germanic tribes erected an earthen rampart more than 400 meters long. This wasn't just a mound. Thousands of hands hauled earth, reinforced it with sod, and then dug in sharpened stakes and intricately woven wattle, transforming the rampart into a genuine fortress wall. And most importantly, they perfectly camouflaged it with branches and foliage. The Romans marched past a meticulously designed fortification, built according to all the rules of military engineering, rules the Romans themselves had taught the Germanic tribes, without even suspecting its existence. They weren't walking through a forest. They were walking alongside a disguised bastion. Step 3. Activating the trap. Arminius waited for the perfect moment. When the majority of the column had already entered the narrow defile, he left Varus on the pretext of gathering allied troops and gave the order. At that very moment, as if in league with the betrayer, the sky unleashed a torrential downpour. The ground instantly turned into viscous, squelching mud. The wooden scutum shields became soaked and impossibly heavy. Bowstrings grew wet and slack, rendering them useless. Soldiers slipped, fell, their morale dissolving with every passing minute under the cold torrents of water. Step 4. The onslaught begins. Picture this scene. A long, vulnerable serpent of men and wagons slithers into a muddy death trap. And suddenly, from the hillside, from the direction where it seemed only forest lay, a deafening roar erupts from thousands of throats, and a deadly hail rains down upon the Romans. Short spears, javelins, stones, everything flies downwards with enormous lethal force. The Romans cannot see the enemy. They only see a wall of branches from behind which death arrives. Discipline shatters instantly. This is no longer a legion, but people thrashing in panic. Step 5. System failure. All Roman tactics relied on communication and command. Centurions issued orders with voice and gestures, legates with standards and horns. But in this deafening chaos, under the roars of the Germanic warriors and the clamor of the downpour, no order could be heard. Standard-bearers fell, adding to the disarray. Attempts to form a testudo, tortoise formation, failed. In the narrow passage, choked with bodies and abandoned wagons, it was impossible. The Roman war machine, this finely tuned mechanism, simply stalled. Each soldier was left alone with the horror. Step 6. The Purge. When the first, most terrifying phase of the attack from the rampart concluded, the Germanic warriors surged down, striking the flanks and rear of the shattered column. Now, it was no longer a battle, but a massacre. The Romans, trapped between the rampart, from which javelins continued to fly, and the mire, where fleeing was tantamount to suicide, became easy prey. Their long pilum spears were useless in the confined space, and their short gladius swords offered no advantage against the longer Germanic swords and spears. The conveyor belt operated flawlessly. It was designed not for victory, but for total annihilation. And there was simply no chapter in Roman military regulations describing how to counter such a nightmare. We often speak of legions, yet we frequently forget that a legion is, first and foremost, made of people. A humble Roman legionary wasn't merely a soldier, he was a walking fortress. On his back, he hauled over 88 pounds of gear, segmented armor, a helmet, a shield, 2 javelins, a sword, and a dagger. Add to that entrenching tools, a saw, a pickaxe, a shovel, plus his personal effects, and at least 2 weeks' worth of grain. He was as resilient as a mule and disciplined beyond any soldier on earth. Every evening, after an exhausting march, he didn't rest. Instead, he meticulously constructed a fortified camp to a standardized design, capable of withstanding any assault. This entire, almost superhuman system functioned thanks to an unwavering belief, faith in the inviolability of order and the genius of their commanders. In the 9th year of our common era, that faith was betrayed. Behind the curtain of this tragedy stood not only the architects of betrayal, but also those who desperately sought to avert it. A pivotal figure, a true unsung hero in this unfolding drama, was Segestes, chief of the Cherusci and father-in-law to Arminius. He wasn't a friend of Rome out of sentimentality. He was a cold pragmatist who understood that open warfare with the empire guaranteed annihilation for his people. He saw that Rome could be contained, negotiated with, and even leveraged for alliance, but to defy it, that was utter madness. He was the architect of potential salvation, while his son-in-law became the engineer of an unparalleled catastrophe. It was Segestes who held the power to alter the course of history. His desperate warning at Varus's feast wasn't mere tattling or denouncement. It was the cry of a man who watched his world hurtle towards an abyss. He offered a straightforward and effective solution: arrest everyone, including himself, to expose the conspiracy. But his words shattered against the formidable wall of Roman self-assurance. Varus saw him only as a jealous father-in-law, and Arminius as a civilized ally. The tragedy lay in Varus's inability to conceive that a barbarian could be smarter, shrewder, and more prescient than he. He trusted the gleaming facade of Romanization rather than the bitter truth. And that fatal error cost 20,000 lives. And who were these individuals whose lives were so precariously balanced? Archaeology grants us a glimpse into their very eyes. In the soil of Kalkriese, archaeologists unearth not only weapons, but also personal effects: fibulae fasteners, gaming dice, artisans' tools, and even a field surgeon's medical instruments. On one metallic artifact, the owner's name is scratched into the surface. This was no faceless multitude. These were distinct individuals, fathers, sons, husbands, veterans who had endured dozens of battles and dreamed of a pension and a small plot of land in Italia, alongside greenhorn recruits from the provinces for whom this was both their first and their last campaign. Each of them carried a personal story that abruptly ended in the mud of the Teutoburg Forest. And here we arrive at the most striking and truly shocking detail, one that illuminates not merely a tactical disparity, but a fathomless cultural chasm separating these two worlds. For a Roman, death in battle was honorable, but the body of a fallen comrade was sacrosanct. It demanded a burial, complete with all due rituals. To be captured was a disgrace, and the desecration of bodies? Unthinkable barbarity. The Germanic tribes, however, thought differently. After the battle, once the last vestiges of resistance had fallen, they enacted a monstrous ritual. Captured centurions and tribunes, the very flower of Roman officers, were not simply executed. They were sacrificed to the Germanic gods of war within sacred groves. Their blood consecrated the tree trunks, and their skulls were nailed to branches as grim trophies. For the Romans, whose world was built upon law and order, this wasn't merely an act of cruelty. It was a terrifying glimpse into the abyss of primeval horror, into a world they utterly failed to comprehend or conquer. This detail, above all else, is the key. Quintilius Varus's catastrophe wasn't simply a military defeat born of betrayal. It was a clash of civilizations, where one side remained utterly oblivious to the other's rules of engagement. The Romans marched to conquer a province, only to find themselves on a foreign altar, becoming the bloody sacrifice, and no amount of tactics or discipline could have ever prepared them for it. The perfect storm began the moment the head of the column funneled into the narrowest part of the ambush. Torrential rain, the roar of thousands of Germanic warriors, and the whistling flight of javelins launched from the earthen ramparts converged into a singular, infernal cacophony. The system that had functioned flawlessly from Britannia to Syria suffered a total, cascading collapse. Reconnaissance was the first to crumble. Forward detachments were annihilated within the opening minutes, leaving the army blind. Then communications snapped. Amidst that deafening roar, Centurion's orders simply drowned, never reaching the soldiers. The legion, once a unified organism, fractured into thousands of terrified, isolated cells. And here, a terrifying dialectic of strength and weakness unfurled. The famed Roman marching column, a brilliant invention for rapid and secure movement through enemy territory, inverted into its very opposite, a 9-mile-long mass grave. Its sheer length rendered the rearguard utterly powerless to assist the vanguard. Its constricted breadth made any deployment into battle formation impossible. Legionaries, accustomed to fighting shoulder to shoulder in an impregnable shield wall, found themselves trapped in a narrow, muddy trench, hindering one another and presenting an ideal stationary target. Their primary weapons turned against them. The massive scooter shields, sodden with rain, became impossibly heavy, shackling their movements. The pilum javelins, designed for throwing in open spaces, were useless against an unseen enemy lurking above. Discipline, the very backbone of the Roman army, founded on the unquestioning execution of orders, evaporated when those orders ceased to exist. Soldiers, trained to operate as cogs in a machine, found themselves lost when the mechanism broke down. Everything that made them formidable on the battlefield became their undoing in the forest. This was starkly evident in the fate of the baggage train. Hundreds of wagons laden with provisions, siege engines, and officers' personal belongings, symbols of Rome's capacity to wage war anywhere, now clogged the narrow pass. Wounded mules thrashed in agony, wagons overturned, blocking all movement. Attempts to organize a retreat or a breakout choked in this man-made bottleneck. Logistics, the lifeblood of the Roman army, transformed into a fatal clot, completely occluding the artery of life. The barbarian tactics, which the Romans disdained as unfair and savage, proved to be the only effective approach under these conditions. The Germanic warriors didn't form ranks. They struck from behind every tree, every piece of cover, delivered a swift blow, and then vanished back into the forest. They were an intrinsic part of this woodland, its very fangs and claws. The Romans, however, were an alien body within it, violently rejected by nature itself. Absolute certainty in their own superiority, which had propelled the legions from one victory to the next, here morphed into fatal blindness. They were not marching into battle, but on a routine suppression of a rebellion. They were not preparing for a war of survival, because the very notion that wild tribes could pose a serious threat to them seemed utterly absurd. It wasn't the weapons of the Germanic tribes that destroyed them, but their own hubris. And so, amidst this inferno, realizing that all, the legions, their honor, the emperor's trust was lost, Quintilius Varus had to make the final command decision of his life. When your army is already dead and the enemy has yet to kill you, what do you defend? Your life or the remnants of your dignity? It is commonly believed that Quintilius Varus was a naive fool who led his legions into an unknown forest on the advice of a traitor. But some historians propose a more nuanced and perhaps more chilling interpretation. According to this view, Varus was no idiot. He was simply following protocol. The Romans, every year at the end of summer, would withdraw troops from forward bases on the eastern bank of the Rhine to their winter camps. Arminius didn't invent the route. He simply knew precisely when and by which road Varus would travel as part of this planned rotation. His genius wasn't in luring a victim into a trap, but in transforming a routine official deployment into a one-way ticket to disaster. To understand the motivations of the parties involved, one must examine the economics. What, after all, was Rome doing in those damp Germanic forests? The answer is simple: resources and markets. For the burgeoning empire, Germania represented the next Klondike. New lands for veterans, timber for the fleet, amber, furs, and most crucially, an inexhaustible source of slaves, the main engine of the Roman economy. The conquest of Germania was not a whim, but a business venture. Varus was less a general and more a crisis manager, dispatched to streamline the operations of a new, underperforming branch of the Roman corporation. It was precisely his methods that ignited the powder keg. He attempted to implement the Roman tax system in Germanic territories. Imagine a society living by barter, where a chief's status is defined by his generosity, not by accumulated wealth. And then a stranger arrives, demanding taxes not in livestock or grain, but in silver coins, which they barely possessed. This wasn't merely plunder, it was a devastating blow to their entire social structure, to the very foundations of their world. Arminius's rebellion was rooted not only in ideology, but also in a powerful economic imperative. It was a desperate attempt to avoid the chains of debt to the empire. Emperor Augustus, upon receiving news of the catastrophe, was not only beating his head against the wall out of humiliation, he was calculating the immense losses. The annihilation of 3 legions constituted a financial disaster of unimaginable proportions. This wasn't merely 20,000 soldiers, it meant 20,000 sets of expensive armor and weaponry, thousands of mules and horses, vital siege equipment, and, crucially, a colossal baggage train laden with the legion's treasury. The total sum of losses was equivalent to the annual budget of several major provinces. With that money, a new aqueduct could have been built for Rome, or the city could have been supplied with free bread for an entire year. It was a gaping hole in the empire's budget that would take decades to mend. But there were losses more profound than mere money. Each legion possessed its sacred standard, the eagle, the aquila. This was far more than an emblem. It embodied the legion's very soul, its honor, and its divine patronage. To lose an eagle was considered the deepest disgrace, an indelible stain on a legion's reputation. In the Teutoburg Forest, 3 eagles were lost in a single stroke. Subsequent punitive expeditions led by Germanicus were driven not so much by a desire for vengeance as by a desperate, almost religious obsession to reclaim these sacred relics, to snatch the souls of the fallen legions from barbarian captivity. And finally, the deepest hidden meaning of this event lies in Arminius's personal choice. He was not merely a Germanic chief, he was a Roman citizen, an equestrian, an officer. A brilliant career lay open before him in the most powerful empire in the world. He could have become wealthy, influential, one of those whom the empire held up as examples. Yet, he deliberately renounced it all. His betrayal was not merely a military stratagem, it was a political and civilizational manifesto. He chose between the ordered comfort of Rome and the wild freedom of the Germanic forest. And that choice forever etched a bloody line across the map of Europe. And now, having seen the brilliantly designed trap, the economic underpinnings, and the human drama of betrayal, all the threads finally converge at a single point. The picture becomes terrifyingly clear. We are accustomed to thinking this was simply a victory of Germanic fury over Roman discipline. But that simplification obscures the true scale of what transpired. To truly grasp what happened in the Teutoburg Forest, we must cease to see this event as merely a battle. The Roman Empire was not just a state, it was a system, a well-oiled, scalable, and incredibly effective algorithm for conquest and assimilation. It consisted of standardized blocks, road construction, the erection of typical camps, the implementation of uniform law, tax collection, and of course, the legions as the primary instrument of coercion. This algorithm had operated flawlessly for centuries, from the sun-scorched sands of Syria to the misty shores of Britannia. The system was so convinced of its own infallibility that it stopped perceiving the surrounding world as an equal opponent, seeing only resources to be exploited and chaos to be brought to order. Now, imagine a man who grew up within this very system. Arminius was not merely a barbarian observing Rome from the outside. He was one of its star graduates. He mastered its language, its laws, its military regulations. He served in its army and saw firsthand how this magnificent machine operated. He was the first and perhaps the only German of his time who understood. It was futile to fight this system head-on. It couldn't be defeated by building a stronger legion, but it could be hacked. So, what is the secret to Arminius's phenomenon and his victory? He wasn't merely a traitor or a talented guerrilla fighter. His genius lay elsewhere. He became history's first systems analyst of asymmetric warfare. He didn't attack Rome's strengths. He found a way to transform them into lethal vulnerabilities. He didn't try to break the Roman machine. He created conditions in which it broke itself. Consider this for yourselves. What was Rome's strength? Discipline and order. Arminius leveraged these very strengths to march a perfectly ordered column straight into a death trap. What else fueled their might? Trust in their commanders and allies. Arminius exploited Varus's personal trust, blinding him to the impending disaster. And their formidable logistics, their heavy armor? Arminius lured them to a place where supply trains became an impassable snarl, and heavy armor, a death sentence. He didn't counter Rome with his own power. Instead, he held up a mirror to Rome's might, reflecting its strengths back as fatal vulnerabilities. This wasn't just a military coup, it was a psychological masterstroke. Arminius had meticulously studied not only Roman tactics, but also their very psyche, their arrogance, their disdain for barbarians, their inability to fathom that any mere savage could ever rival their strategic intellect. He played their stereotypes like a finely tuned instrument. His entire operation hinged on the Romans acting predictably, precisely because they couldn't conceive of any scenario other than their own eternal triumph. And therein lies the true magnitude of his scheme. This was no mere guerrilla raid. It was an intellectual sabotage of titanic proportions. Arminius, in essence, took the very gifts of Rome, their capacity for systematic thought, their foresight in planning, their mastery of complex logistics, and with surgical precision turned them against the Romans themselves. He didn't just defeat 3 legions. That day in the Teutoburg Forest, the Germanic chieftain proved he understood the essence of Roman genius better than the Romans themselves. That is precisely why Quintilius Varus's catastrophe wasn't merely a defeat for the Roman army. It was a systemic collapse for Rome, a system that, for the first time, confronted not an external foe, but its own reflection, honed to lethal perfection. This is the story of how even the most sophisticated system can be dismantled from within by one individual who meticulously understood its rules and exposed its singular yet fatal flaw. The domino effect unleashed in the Teutoburg Forest reverberated across the centuries, irrevocably shaping the contours of modern Europe. The first and most pivotal consequence was the decision by Emperor Augustus, and subsequently his successor Tiberius, to halt eastward expansion. The Rhine transformed from a temporary military frontier into a permanent civilizational demarcation. For 1,000 years, it stood as a formidable barrier between the world of Latin, Roman law, and Mediterranean culture, and the realm of Germanic languages, customary law, and a forested northern culture. France and Spain speak Romance languages, while Germany and England speak Germanic tongues, largely because Arminius won his battle. That bloody forest trail became a fault line that persists even today. But the legacy of that battle lives on, not just on maps. We encounter its echoes every day, often without realizing it. Picture a 19th century German romantic seeking the roots of the Germanic nation. He stumbles upon Tacitus's annals and reads the saga of Arminius. Suddenly, the wild chieftain of the Cherusci morphs into Hermann, the first national hero, the unifier of Germany, the freedom fighter against foreign invaders. Gigantic monuments are erected in his honor. Operas and poems are penned about him. This narrative becomes one of the foundational myths upon which modern German identity is built. When you hear the word Teutonic, you're hearing a distant echo of that very battle. Or consider another compelling example. The Roman military machine indeed learned crucial lessons from the catastrophe. A sweeping reform of border defense was implemented. Instead of aggressive expansion deep into barbarian territories, the empire shifted to a strategy of deep defense, establishing the renowned limes, a system of fortifications, forts, and watchtowers along the Rhine and Danube rivers. This concept of a stationary, fortified frontier, demarcating civilization from the barbarian world, became an archetype repeatedly replicated throughout history, from the Great Wall of China to contemporary border fences. The very idea that an empire could and should possess a clear, defensible boundary was forged in the fires of that defeat. Over time, however, Arminius's original vision, his struggle for freedom and the preservation of identity, was paradoxically twisted. In the 20th century, his image was usurped by nationalist and Nazi propaganda. The hero who fought against imperial oppression was recast as a symbol of aggressive militarism and racial supremacy. His name was invoked to justify wars and conquests, precisely the very things he himself had fought against. It stands as a chilling testament to how history can be turned inside out, and a freedom fighter warped into an icon for tyranny. Perhaps the most subtle and enduring legacy is the very concept of the noble savage. The image of freedom-loving Germanic peoples, described by Tacitus as a stark contrast to a corrupted Rome, became incredibly popular among Enlightenment thinkers and romantics. They saw them not merely as barbarians, but as carriers of pristine moral purity, courage, and independence. This romantic myth, born from an attempt to make sense of Varus's defeat, still thrives in our culture, in fantasy novels, films, and games, where the barbarian often proves more honest and honorable than the representatives of so-called civilized nations. Thus, one bloody week in September of the 9th year of our common era didn't just obliterate 3 legions. It drew a line on the map, created a national hero, reshaped an empire's military strategy, and spawned cultural myths that resonate with us to this very day. It wasn't merely the end of a campaign, it was the dawn of a new Europe. We live in a world of global systems, financial, informational, political. These systems are incredibly complex and efficient, permeating every aspect of our lives, creating the illusion of complete control and predictability. We trust algorithms, believe in the immutability of institutions, and assume our high-tech world is immune to catastrophes like the one that befell Quintilius Varus. But the story of his demise isn't just an ancient Roman tale, it's a chilling warning for all of us. Consider the parallels. The Roman Empire was the most sophisticated global system of its time. It boasted advanced infrastructure, the most powerful army, a unified legal framework, and an unshakable belief in its own infallibility. Romans were utterly convinced that their model for world order was the only correct and universal one. Any resistance they encountered was perceived not as an alternative viewpoint, but as a manifestation of savagery and ignorance that needed to be corrected either by force or assimilation. It was precisely this systemic overconfidence that became their Achilles' heel. They believed so staunchly in their algorithm that they stopped noticing anomalies. Segestes' warning was such an anomaly. It didn't fit into a worldview where a Romanized barbarian couldn't betray them. They saw before them not an individual with complex motivations, but a function successfully integrated into the system. They underestimated the power of resentment, the burning desire for freedom, and the profound cultural chasm hidden beneath a veneer of loyalty. And here is the crucial, non-trivial lesson that this history screams to us from the depths of time. The greatest danger to any complex system comes not from an external enemy, but from an internal breakdown caused by the system's inability to comprehend what lies beyond its own logic. A system that considers itself universal becomes blind. It starts to ignore the human factor, emotions, cultural codes, and irrational motives that simply don't fit into its neat models. And at some point, its own Arminius emerges, a person who knows the system from the inside and exploits its very blindness and predictability to strike at its heart. This is a lesson that total control is an illusion, that any civilization, no matter how powerful, is vulnerable if it loses the capacity for empathy and respect for the other. That arrogance and disdain for those we deem backward or wrong inevitably lead to catastrophe. The story of Varus is an eternal reminder that technological superiority should never be confused with wisdom. Ultimately, this is a story about the cost of misunderstanding. Rome paid for it with 3 legions and an imperial frontier. In the 21st century, in a world where the stakes are immeasurably higher and the consequences of errors can be global, we simply cannot afford the luxury of repeating this mistake, because our Teutoburg Forest could prove far more terrifying. Let's, for a moment, commit an act of intellectual treason and view this story through Germanic eyes. We are accustomed to the Roman portrayal of the barbarian, a wild-eyed savage in furs, brandishing an axe, incapable of complex thought. This caricatured image was nothing more than propaganda designed to justify conquests. The reality was immeasurably more complex. Germanic society was not chaos. It was a different order, a vibrant, organic one, built not on written laws but on oaths of loyalty, not on stone cities but on kinship ties. Their world was self-sufficient. Their gods resided in sacred groves, and their freedom was not an abstraction, but the very air they breathed. Now, imagine how Rome invaded this world. How utterly alien and incomprehensible the Romans themselves must have seemed in the eyes of the Germanic tribes. Picture this endless centipede of steel and leather, monotonously crawling across your land, leaving behind an ugly, death-straight scar of a road. They erect their ominous square camps, chopping down your sacred trees. They speak a language that sounds like grinding stones and demand silver from you for the right to live on the land of your ancestors. Their judge, an itinerant official, dispenses justice from books no one has read, overturning the decisions of your elders, whose wisdom has been proven by generations. This was a shock, not of cruelty, but of sheer absurdity. For a Germanic warrior whose valor was proven in personal combat, the sight of legionaries marching in faceless formation, like ants, was something unnatural. Where was their personal honor? Where was their individual fury? They seemed less like warriors and more like cogs in some terrifying machine. The Roman obsession with order, right angles, censuses and taxes appeared to be a dangerous madness. They didn't try to understand this world. They tried to cram it into their standardized administrative cells, stifling all life within. And in this lies the tragedy of predictability that doomed Varus. The Germanic tribes were strong in their unpredictability, their connection to nature, their ability to adapt on the fly. The Romans, however, were strong in their system, their routines, their predictability. Arminius, the only one who understood both worlds, saw in this a fatal vulnerability. He understood that the Romans would follow their regulations, even if those regulations led them to their graves. They would take the shortest route because it was more efficient. They would enter a narrow gorge because they trusted their scouts and their strength. They would not believe in the treachery of a Romanized ally because it didn't fit into their worldview. They would try to form battle lines under a hail of spears because that was the only thing they knew how to do. Their strengths, order, discipline, logic became their greatest weaknesses in a clash with a world that operated by different rules. The Romans lost not because the Germanic tribes were stronger. They lost because their own system was so perfect and rigid that it lacked a single contingency protocol for encountering true chaos orchestrated by genius. Their greatest virtue, disciplina, became their death sentence. A great victory was won, the euphoria of blood and freedom intoxicating, but it was precisely at this moment that the true ordeal began for Arminius. He needed to solidify the fragile alliance of tribes that had feuded for centuries. And so, he made a decision that would forever sever him from the world in which he had grown up. The captured Roman officers, men with whom he had perhaps once shared a tent and wine, were not granted a swift death. They were sacrificed to the Germanic gods in sacred groves. This was not blind rage. This was a cold political calculation to bind all the chieftains with common blood, to commit a sacrilege so monstrous by Roman standards that no one could ever turn back. He wasn't burning bridges behind his army, he was burning them in the souls of his allies. And at this very moment, the burden of victory began to corrode him from within. Arminius, the Roman knight who knew Latin and valued strategy, was forced to become the very barbarian his enemy had so despised. To retain power, he had to rule not by the force of law, but by the power of personal authority, constantly proving he was the strongest, the cleverest, the cruelest. He liberated his people from Rome, but found himself imprisoned by constant suspicion, intrigue, and the fear of betrayal. He looked at his comrades and saw future rivals. The solitude at the summit of power, won at such a cost, was absolute. The idealist who dreamed of freedom for his people gradually transformed into the tyrant necessary for their protection. Yet, the most devastating offering on the altar of his ambition was laid not in a sacred grove, but within his own home. His wife, Thusnelda, daughter of his sworn enemy, Segestes, became a pawn in this grand game. Arminius abducted and married her against her father's will, transforming a political conflict into a personal vendetta. He fought for the future of his people, yet he could not protect his own family. Several years after the battle, Segestes seized the opportune moment, capturing his pregnant daughter and handing her over to the Romans. Imagine, if you will, the sheer horror and humiliation of that moment for Arminius. The man who had vanquished 3 legions found himself powerless when the enemy struck not at his army, but at his very heart. He could only watch from afar as his bitterest foe, the general Germanicus, carried his pregnant wife away to Rome. Thus Nelda, daughter of the Cherusci chieftain and wife of their greatest hero, lived out her days as an honored prisoner in the Eternal City. The apotheosis of this personal tragedy came with Germanicus's triumph in Rome. Through the city streets paraded the spoils captured in Germania, but the main prize, upon which the crowds fixated, was she, Thusnelda, clutching her infant son, born already in captivity. Arminius's son, who would never see his father or his homeland. Arminius won the war for Germania, but he lost everything dear to him. He etched his name in history as a liberator, yet he paid for it with a shattered life, lost love, and the stolen future of his lineage. Herein lies his true tragedy. The price of genius proved exorbitantly high. When we speak of a clash of civilizations, we often envision a peaceful exchange, a sort of ancient cultural festival. But along the frontier between Rome and Germania, it was no melting pot. Rather, it was a high-pressure zone where two tectonic plates of worldviews ground against each other, generating seismic shifts. The initial clash unfolded on the very landscape. The Romans brought with them geometry, straight roads carving through sacred forests and rectilinear forts biting into the earth like alien implants. To a German, whose world consisted of winding paths and organically scattered settlements, this obsession with right angles was something monstrous, a violence against nature itself. This conflict permeated the spiritual realm as well. The Romans erected temples to their gods, Jupiter, Mars, structures that were ordered, stone, and readily comprehensible. Germans worshipped their deities in the silent embrace of ancient groves, where every oak served as an altar. When the Romans felled such a grove to construct a fort, from their perspective, they were merely clearing a construction site. From the German viewpoint, they were committing deicide, a sacrilege demanding bloody retribution. The sacrifice of captured centurions was not simply an act of brutality, but a mirror-image response to this spiritual desecration. And yet, even within this zone of perpetual conflict, strange and perilous hybrids began to emerge. The most striking example was the Germanic warrior himself, serving in the Roman legions. The Roman army, like a colossal vacuum cleaner, drew in barbarian youth, enticing them with promises of pay, citizenship, and a share of the spoils. These soldiers from the auxiliary units, the auxilia, learned to fight in Roman formations, comprehend Latin commands, and appreciate discipline. They returned to their tribes as utterly transformed individuals, deadly machines who knew their enemy from the inside out. These were the first mutants of this war, and Arminius was the most formidable of them all. Archaeology offers us yet another example of this hybridization. In the burials of Germanic chieftains from that era, we uncover astonishing finds. Alongside traditional fibulae and pottery lie Roman spathae, long swords, elegant glass goblets, and silver coins. This was not a sign of assimilation. A Germanic chieftain had no desire to become Roman. He coveted Roman technology and luxury goods to become an even more formidable Germanic chieftain. A Roman sword in his hand was not a badge of loyalty, but a symbol of status and power which he could wield against its very creators. But how did the life of the common person change, caught at this crossroads of worlds? Envision a Germanic peasant whose village found itself nestled beside a new Roman fort. On one hand, it was a catastrophe. Taxes, requisitions, the constant presence of an alien armed force. Ancient customs and beliefs hung in the balance. But on the other, it presented new opportunities. The legionaries required foodstuffs, hides, and fodder, and they were prepared to pay for these with clinking silver coin. Suddenly, an economy driven by money burst into a world where exchange and prestige decided everything. A new path to advancement emerged, not through valor in battle, but through trade with the occupiers. This fractured society. Some retreated to the forests to wage guerrilla warfare, while others began supplying grain to the Romans, becoming affluent under new, bewildering rules. The old system of values, rooted in honor and tribal loyalty, began to crack. So, this melting pot was more akin to a war zone, where not only armies clashed, but also ways of life, gods, and economic models. It wasn't a peaceful integration, but a brutal struggle for survival in which both sides, unwittingly, transformed themselves, borrowing the enemy's weapons, goods, and ideas to wield them in the next confrontation. The Europe we know was born not from camaraderie, but from this fierce, uncompromising, and incredibly fertile conflict. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest didn't end when the clash of swords fell silent. Immediately afterward, a second, equally ferocious battle began. a battle for the narrative, an information war where rumors, myths, and targeted propaganda were the weapons. Arminius, lacking a written language, forged his myth in oral tradition. He was not just a victorious chieftain. Bards composed songs about him, portraying him as divinely chosen, aided by nature itself in crushing the enemy. The capture of the 3 sacred eagles became his ultimate propaganda triumph. He paraded them across Germanic lands, displaying them as irrefutable proof. The gods of Rome had fallen. Their power was spent. This was not merely a trophy. It was a visible symbol of the end of the era of Roman dominance. Rome, in turn, unleashed a powerful counter-propaganda campaign. To admit that their legions had been strategically outmaneuvered would be to acknowledge a barbarian as their equal. This was unthinkable. Therefore, the official version, disseminated by historians, was different. In it, Arminius appeared not as a genius, but as a cunning and ungrateful traitor. The emphasis was not on his tactical talents, but on his moral failings. Rome, which had given him education, citizenship, and high rank, was depicted as the innocent victim of perfidy. This narrative was incredibly convenient. It absolved Varus of blame, presenting him as merely too trusting, and transformed a military defeat into a moral tragedy. To thoroughly demonize the enemy, Roman authors eagerly recounted the horrors perpetrated by the Germans after their victory. Ritual sacrifices, skulls nailed to trees, desecration of bodies. This was a classic tactic of negative campaigning. The enemy was portrayed not as a soldier, but as a monster, subhuman, with whom there could be no negotiations, only total annihilation. It was this image of the wild, bloodthirsty barbarian that became entrenched in European culture for centuries. And it must be acknowledged, Rome's information campaign proved incredibly successful. Even today, when discussing this battle, our primary recollection is of betrayal, not strategy. But history, as we know, is written by the victors. And in this case, the victors who penned the history were the Romans. Their version of events remained dominant for nearly 2,000 years. It wasn't until the 21st century that we gained a silent witness from the side of the vanquished, the archaeological park of Kalkriese. And this witness told an entirely different story. Roman sources, such as Tacitus, described the battle as a spontaneous ambush in a wild forest, where the Germans' main allies were rain and mud. This paints a picture of chaotic butchery, not a planned operation. But what do we see at Kalkriese? We see a perfectly positioned, long earthen rampart, constructed according to all the rules of fortification. Its creation would have required weeks or even months of coordinated effort from thousands of people, precise engineering calculations, and the strictest secrecy. Archaeology transformed the Roman narrative of a treacherous ambush into a story of a brilliant engineering operation. This was not merely a guerrilla raid. This was a battle of annihilation, meticulously prepared according to all the rules of military art, where one side utilized the landscape and engineered structures with ingenious precision. The soil of Kalkriese told us a truth that Roman historians either didn't know or chose to conceal, so as not to acknowledge the intellectual superiority of their enemy. And this proves that sometimes the most truthful historical source is not parchment, but the very ground on which that history unfolded. Roman punitive expeditions were repelled. The sacred eagles, though not all of them, were reclaimed. The enemy was driven back across the Rhine and, it seemed, had permanently abandoned the idea of conquest. At this juncture, Arminius faced his moment of greatest triumph and greatest temptation. The vision of a liberated Germania was realized. But what happens when the external enemy, the glue holding an alliance together, retreats? The grand coalition of tribes, forged by his will, began to unravel. And Arminius made a fatal decision. He resolved that Germany's freedom needed defending not only from Rome, but also from the Germans themselves, from their eternal feuds. This required a unified, strong authority, his authority. The goal ceased to be a means, and the means, power, became an end in itself. It was at this precise moment that his mirror image, Maroboduus, king of the powerful Marcomanni tribe, stood in his path. Like Arminius, Maroboduus had spent his youth in Rome, understanding its strengths and weaknesses, but he chose a different route. He didn't wage war against the empire. He led his people eastward to the territory of modern-day Czechia and built a powerful, centralized kingdom there, modeled after Rome. He was a pragmatist who preferred armed neutrality to a suicidal war. To Arminius, intoxicated by the idea of pan-Germanic unity, Maroboduus was a betrayer of the common cause. To Maroboduus, Arminius was a dangerous upstart whose ambitions threatened the entire region. A schism erupted within the victor's camp. Yesterday's potential allies became mortal enemies. This was not merely a conflict between two chieftains, it was a dispute between two visions for Germany's future. Arminius proposed a path of revolutionary unification from below through a charismatic leader in the name of common liberty. Maroboduus championed a path of conservative stability, a strong monarchical state that could coexist with Rome. Arminius sent Maroboduus the severed head of Varus as a call to alliance. Maroboduus sent that same head to Rome as a token of his loyalty. The point of no return had been crossed. And then occurred the most dreadful, most symbolic act, marking the ultimate betrayal of the original idea. Arminius gathered a massive army and marched to war not against the Romans, but against the Marcomanni. The first great inter-Germanic war in history had begun. People who could have been brothers in arms, whose fathers perhaps fought together in Teutoburg Forest, now slaughtered one another. The battle between the armies of Arminius and Maroboduus was grand and bloody. But no matter who won, the losing side was the very idea of a free and united Germany. On that day, not an army died on the battlefield, but a dream that the Germans could unite for something greater than mere hatred of a common enemy. Arminius, the liberator, transformed into a conqueror, spilling German blood to consolidate his own power. Though he formally triumphed, forcing Maroboduus to retreat, this victory was Pyrrhic. The great coalition was shattered. Trust in him as a selfless leader was eroded. Now, he was seen not as a savior, but as a potential tyrant, a man who sought to be king of all Germans. And the finale of this drama was logical and tragic. Just a few years after his greatest victory over Rome and his dubious victory over Maroboduus, Arminius was murdered. But he was not slain by Roman legionaries. He was cut down by his own kinsmen, his relatives, who feared his exorbitant ambitions. The man who had granted the Germans freedom from Rome was executed by them for attempting to seize their freedom from each other. The great liberator fell victim to the very liberty for which he had fought. This was the ultimate bankruptcy of his grand vision. So who won in this new world, free from Rome? Not the old chieftains, whose power rested on wisdom and tradition, and certainly not the pro-Roman faction, which overnight transformed from pragmatists into traitors. The new masters of life were the warlords, the captains of warrior bands whose power was forged in battle. This was a new aristocracy of the sword, not of blood. Their currency was reputation, their law was the personal loyalty of their warriors, and their capitals were temporary camps brimming with captured weapons. Society, which had previously been relatively egalitarian, became sharply militarized. A person's status was now determined not by how many cows they owned, but by how many toughs they paid and how good their Roman sword was. The economy of this brave new world was literally forged from the bones of Varus's legions. The spoils of war, gold, silver, weapons, armor, didn't enrich a central treasury. No, such a thing barely existed. Instead, it was parceled out directly to the warriors. This was a colossal infusion of capital that utterly reshaped economic networks. Loyalty, it turned out, was now for sale. Warriors pledged their allegiance not to their tribal chiefs, but to anyone who could offer them the finest armor and the most silver. This sparked an age of incessant internecine strife, where yesterday's allies became today's bitter enemies in the scramble for resources and manpower. The lucrative trade routes with Rome, once a reliable source of income for border tribes, lay shattered. The economic heartland shifted deep into the forests, gravitating towards the most ruthless and fortunate warlords. So, what kind of psyche did this victory unleash? It wasn't pure euphoria, but rather a traumatic exhilaration. On the one hand, for the first time, the Germanic tribes began to perceive themselves as a cohesive entity, capable of vanquishing an invincible foe. This delivered a potent shot of national pride. Yet, on the other hand, this triumph was swiftly followed by years of brutal, punitive expeditions led by Germanicus. The Romans weren't attempting to conquer territory, they were enacting vengeance. They torched villages, enslaved women and children, and desecrated sacred sites. The euphoria of victory morphed into a constant, draining dread of retribution. Life devolved into an endless guerrilla war. The worldview of the people shifted fundamentally. Before Varus's catastrophe, Rome was merely a powerful and perilous neighbor. Afterward, it mutated into an absolute metaphysical evil, a civilization of death, bringing slavery and sacrilege. A stark binary code of us versus them solidified. Us represented the free peoples of the forest, living by the laws of honor and nature. Them was the soulless machinery of empire, a force to be annihilated or driven out. This ideology deeply permeated their cultural DNA, shaping their interactions with the Roman world for centuries to come. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest became their genesis point, the foundational myth of their free world. But this newfound freedom also cast a long, dark shadow. Far from unifying the Germanic tribes, the victory instead unleashed all the demons of internal strife. The pro-Roman faction wasn't merely ousted from power, its members became targets of a ruthless hunt. Segestes, who had warned Varus, was forced to flee to Roman protection to save his life. Society fractured into patriots and collaborators. Families turned against families, brother against brother. The triumph over an external foe devolved into a brutal civil war that smoldered for decades, poisoning the fruits of their grand victory. Ultimately, the society that emerged from this grinding crucible was utterly transformed. It was more brutal, more suspicious, and profoundly traumatized. They gained freedom, but at the cost of their internal peace. The Germanic tribes had proven they could unite to repel an external threat. Yet they also proved to themselves that they couldn't maintain that unity in a world devoid of enemies. And this tragic paradox became their historical curse. Beneath the clash of weapons and the cries of the dying in this narrative lies not just a military conflict, but a titanic clash of two incompatible philosophical systems, two fundamentally different ways of perceiving reality. The driving force behind Rome was the philosophy of order, not merely order on the battlefield, but a cosmic, universal order. In the Roman worldview, the world was divided into cosmos, the ordered, comprehensible, law-abiding territory of the empire, and chaos, everything beyond its borders. A legionary carving a road through the forest wasn't just a soldier, he was a missionary, bringing the light of reason and geometry into the wild darkness. This was the philosophy of the right angle, a belief that the world could and should be charted, measured, taxed, and subjected to a single, universal algorithm. But who was the intellectual engine, the grey eminence on the other side? Arminius had no Aristotle of his own. His chief and sole teacher was Rome itself. After spending years at the empire's heart, he became the first anthropologist of Roman power. He saw that behind the facade of law, lex, lurked brute force, vis. He understood that Rome's universal order was not a gift, but a tool of subjugation. He studied not merely tactics, but the enemy's very operating system, its cultural codes, its deeply held beliefs. Arminius was a product of the Roman system who turned its own greatest weapon, systemic analysis, against it. He was the one who looked at the clock, understood how its gears turned, and then slipped a grain of sand into its intricate mechanism. At the core of his actions lay an alternative philosophy, one that could be dubbed the philosophy of organic freedom. This wasn't an abstract notion of human rights. It was a belief deeply rooted in the earth, in blood, in tradition, the conviction that every tribe, every clan had the right to live by its own laws, to breathe its own air. If Rome brought the world an artificial imposed order, Arminius defended a natural order, one that grew out of life itself, just as a tree grows from the soil. For him, a Roman road wasn't a boon of civilization, but a scar on the living earth, and Roman law, a dead letter killing the spirit of custom. It was this clash of ideas that ignited the primary internal conflict within the Germanic world. Opposing Arminius was a third doctrine, the philosophy of pragmatic survival, championed by Segestes and other pro-Roman chiefs. Their logic was straightforward and, in its own way, compelling. Rome was a force of nature, like a flood or a wildfire. It was pointless to fight it head-on. It would only burn and drown everything. The only sensible path was to adapt, to integrate into its system, learn its language, trade with it, serve it, and profit from it, all while retaining at least a fraction of their identity. This was the philosophy of compromise, a deal with reality. The struggle between Arminius and Segestes was more than just a personal vendetta. It was a collision of two irreconcilable answers to a fundamental question. What was more vital, the survival of the people or the preservation of their soul? Arminius proposed risking everything for absolute freedom, even if the price was utter annihilation. Segestes offered to sacrifice a portion of freedom for guaranteed survival. It was precisely this philosophical chasm, not Roman swords, that ultimately fractured Germanic society. It led to civil war, betrayals, and eventually to Arminius's own demise. Rome might retreat beyond the Rhine, but the dispute it brought remained. The argument over where the line lay between wise compromise and treachery, between heroic struggle and senseless suicide. And for the Germanic tribes, this debate proved more terrifying than any legions. And this is where the most tragic act of this drama begins. As soon as the last Roman legion receded beyond the Rhine, as soon as the threat that had forged the fragile Germanic alliance vanished, the grand system born from Arminius's will began to devour itself. There was no external enemy left, and the most fearsome foe for a German once again became another German. That very blend of tribal pride and shared hatred that had crushed Varus instantly cracked, cooling in the glow of victory. An inexorable gravitational collapse began. Arminius's system was doomed from the start because it was built not on institutions, but on charisma. It was not a blueprint for a state, but a blueprint for war. As soon as the war ended, the chiefs who had followed Arminius lost their reason to obey him. The very freedom they had fought for turned out to be the freedom to listen to no one but themselves. The great coalition disintegrated into its primal elements, tribes, clans, and the ambitions of individual warlords, and each of them now looked at Arminius not as a savior, but as the main threat to their own power. The battle for the inheritance began while the testator was still alive. The inheritance was the very idea of leadership over all Germanic peoples. Arminius's comrades in arms, yesterday's brothers in battle, began to tear his grand vision apart, each interpreting it to their own advantage. They argued, "We fought for freedom from Roman tyranny, so why should we tolerate the tyranny of one of our own?" His push for centralization, his attempts to create a unified army and a unified policy were no longer seen as necessities, but as excessive ambitions. The word that became his death sentence was Latin, rex, king. His enemies within the Germanic world began to spread rumors that Arminius wanted to become not just first among equals, but a true monarch in the Roman style. For Germanic chiefs, whose power had always been constrained by a council of elders, this was the most terrifying accusation. The liberator from the Roman yoke was himself accused of wanting to shackle the Germanic peoples with a new, self-imposed one. The irony was devastating. And so the hunt began. Not for Romans, but for their greatest hero. This wasn't an open war, but a series of conspiracies, intrigues and betrayals. Those who had once sworn allegiance to him beneath sacred oak trees now secretly sharpened their knives against him. He found himself utterly isolated. The Romans hated him as a traitor, and the Germanic peoples feared him as a tyrant. The ending was inevitable. Arminius, a man who had survived dozens of battles and vanquished Rome's finest generals, wasn't killed in combat. He fell at the hands of his own kin, his closest associates, who lured him into a trap. This was more than just an assassination, it was a symbolic act. The hero liberator was slain not by his enemies, but by the very people he had granted freedom. Arminius himself became the last shard of a grand dream. With his death, the very possibility of a unified, independent Germany, forged in the fires of conflict with Rome, perished. This historical crossroads, this chance to establish an alternative center of power in Europe, was forever lost. Germany plunged back into a maelstrom of intertribal wars, becoming easy prey for Roman diplomacy, which skillfully applied the principle of divide and conquer. The era of heroic resistance concluded, giving way to centuries of fragmentation. Arminius's death marked the final point after which the great system self-destructed, leaving behind only a bloody legend. After Arminius's demise, his legacy met a fate almost as tragic as his life. Lacking their own written language, the Germanic peoples were unable to record his history. His exploits dissolved into oral traditions, becoming distorted, forgotten, and eventually almost entirely vanishing into the mists of the Dark Ages. For more than 1,400 years, Arminius, the liberator of Germany, was known only to a narrow circle of Latin scholars, and he was known through the texts of his enemies, the Romans. To the world, he was not a hero, but a footnote in the empire's history, a cunning traitor who caused trouble but ultimately received his just deserts. His own story, told in his own voice, died with him. Then, in the 15th century, a miracle occurred. In the library of a German monastery, humanists discovered and painstakingly copied forgotten manuscripts by the Roman historian Tacitus. For Germany of that era, fragmented, searching for its identity, and under the cultural and political sway of papal Rome, these texts were an intellectual bombshell. In the annals, they read not merely of Varus's defeat, they found their lost hero, a man who, long before them, had said no to Roman domination. The moment of this rediscovery was a true second birth. German humanist Ulrich von Hutten and other thinkers of the Reformation era became the godfathers of a new myth. It was they who took the Latin name Arminius and, based on its phonetic similarity, transformed it into the proud Germanic Hermann. Arminius, chief of the Cherusci, was dead. Long live Hermann, the first German. This was more than just a renaming, it was a complete reboot of his image. He began to be portrayed as an ancient Martin Luther, rising against the tyranny of Rome. But it was precisely here that the great misreading began. New eras imbued the figure of Hermann with meanings that Arminius himself could never have conceived. The chief who fought for his tribe's freedom and desperately tried to maintain a fragile military alliance was transformed into a nationalist dreaming of a unified Germany. 19th century ideas were ascribed to him, turning him into an ancient Bismarck. This new, convenient myth proved incredibly popular. In the 19th century, on the wave of resistance against Napoleon and later the unification of Germany, the cult of Hermann reached its zenith. A colossal monument, the Hermannsdenkmal, was erected in the Teutoburg Forest. The enormous warrior, sword raised to the sky, gazes not south toward Italy, but west toward France, the new Rome, the new enemy. Arminius became an empty vessel that each era filled with its own fears, hopes, and hatreds. Most tragically, this process of distortion did not stop. In the 20th century, the myth of Hermann the Liberator was usurped by Nazi propaganda, which transformed him into an Aryan superhuman, a symbol of racial purity in the struggle against decadent Rome. The fighter for freedom became an icon for the most terrible tyranny in history. Thus, history completed a full, monstrous circle. The great legacy was not merely forgotten. It was discovered, reanimated, and twisted into its complete opposite. And so, our journey brings us full circle. We began with a straightforward, almost technical question. How could three supposedly invincible Roman legions meet their doom? Yet, what we uncovered was no mere military chronicle, but a profound parable, a meditation on the very essence of power, on the brilliance of genius and its steep cost, on the genesis and demise of ideologies. Arminius's saga isn't a simple tale of triumph. It's the recounting of a grand, tragic cycle that, it seems, endlessly repeats itself. At the dawn of this cycle stood a system, Rome itself, unshakable in its conviction of its own righteousness, its inherent superiority, its eternal dominion. It bestowed upon the world order, law, and paved roads, genuinely convinced these were absolute goods. Its ambition was to assimilate, to standardize, to sculpt the entire known world into a comprehensible, manageable matrix. This very system, in its relentless efficiency, unwittingly forged its ideal product. Arminius, a man who had absorbed its logic, mastered its language, and honed its military arts. And this product, the system's most exquisitely crafted creation, became the very instrument of its devastating downfall. He breached its defenses, exploiting its own predictability and its inherent arrogance. Yet, the cycle did not conclude there. Having vanquished the established order, Arminius attempted to erect one of his own, and it immediately crumbled, plunging back into the very internecine chaos from which he had sought to rescue his people. Subsequently, his legacy was forgotten, only to be rediscovered and distorted beyond recognition, morphing into a potent tool for constructing new, even more terrifying systems. Order had birthed chaos, which in turn birthed a new order. The circle had closed, utterly. And herein lies the central, intractable paradox of this entire narrative. In its desperate bid to eradicate barbarian chaos, Rome unwittingly tutored that very chaos to think systematically. It spawned a monster that proved smarter than its progenitor, for it understood both the logic of order and the furious roar of freedom. And gazing upon this 2,000-year spiral, we inevitably arrive at one final, overarching question. Can any grand system, utterly convinced of its own infallibility, ever truly perceive the emergence of its own Arminius in time? Or is its blindness not a flaw, but an inherent characteristic, a fatal bug woven into the very code of any great power?